Hello and welcome to Explain It to a Comedian. I'm Sammy Obeid.
I'm Dhaya Lakshminarayanan.
And I'm Victor Lyonnet.
We're comedians. What is it that you do?
I'm a professor, and most of my time I spend doing research and some of it teaching.
What exactly do you research?
I do research in two different areas. One is financial intermediation and banking regulation, and the other one that we're going to talk about is entrepreneurship and the financing of high-growth startups.
In your research, what have you found so far about the financing of high-growth startups?
Well, I've been looking at the decisions that potential financiers take, and in particular, early-stage financiers such as venture capitalists. I'm trying to understand how innovation and those startups that are likely to disrupt the economy and grow are being financed, and whether decision-making in that area is optimal.
What characterizes high growth? Because I made maybe $10,000 last year. Am I growing quickly?
Well, what venture capitalists care about and those financiers is your potential to keep growing. And if you have made $10,000 last year, that's pretty good. But what people are going to look at is whether you're going to make $20,000 this year, $30,000 the year after, or potentially even more.
So if Sammy were a startup, how would he go about getting investors?
Well, there are two ways startups can get money from venture capitalists. They could either reach out to them and try and convince them that their startup is very promising, or they are so good on their own that people would come and look for them.
So message VCs on Instagram, just say, hey, looking for some big dollar sign. I'm high growth. I made 10,000 last year. Hit HMU, that means hit me up.
Well, that's kind of what happens in real life when you're trying to make friends or find a date. But in the dating market for VCs and startups, it usually happens through more professional networks such as LinkedIn. Or maybe through your network because you've been to a school where potentially you've met a lot of people who are also entrepreneurs and themselves have been funded. Or perhaps you know people who are venture capitalists themselves.
What's the hit me up equivalent on LinkedIn?
Well, that's a good question. I know that LinkedIn gives you a notification if somebody has looked at your profile. What some people do when they create a startup and are looking for potential financiers is they switch their job and they say that they went from working at these very large incumbents such as Google, and all of a sudden they started their firm. And that's how a lot of venture capitalists actually find potential deal flow that they want to invest in.
Yeah, I think on LinkedIn it's like, congratulations on your business. How can I be of service?
Is it usually that venture capitalists message entrepreneurs first, or is it like Bumble where entrepreneurs can message venture capitalists first?
It can go both ways. I think those startups that are the most promising have a lot of competition out there for their potential financiers. And venture capitalists sometimes find it hard to invest in a given firm, and some of them actually sometimes self-censor because they know they're not good enough for that startup. But it can really go both ways.
What do they look for?
They look for entrepreneurs who have knowledge of the business, who started a firm in a market that has so much potential that the firm can grow in this exponential manner that I described at the beginning.
In summary, white guys.
Well, if you look at the profile of entrepreneurs, obviously they are not representative of the population. But it's very hard to know why that is the case. And that's kind of what I'm trying to understand in the paper.
So you study a lot on VCs, and I hear you have an obsession with centaurs.
Well, so this is a term that comes from the computer science literature, which probably is a bunch of nerds in a very stereotypical way. And centaur is kind of like this mix between, nature and human. And people have translated that into like a mix between, machine-based decision-making and humans. And this is the way that the machine learning literature combined with like finance or economics has evolved. The idea is that decisions should be aided by machine learning, but not replaced by it.
So instead of Centaur, would you prefer Transformer or Voltron?
I am not a big Hollywood fan, and I couldn't pick between the two personally.
Yeah, Transformers are more than meets the eye, so we don't have to talk about it right now.
So for people who don't know much about VCs or private equity in general, why would you say like what you study is important?
Well, I think it's very important because venture capitalists are enabling small firms to grow and to potentially disrupt incumbents, to come up with innovations that matter a lot for growth. Like if you think of a lot of innovations that have been breakthroughs throughout the years, a lot of them have come from small firms.
Can you give us an example?
Well, OpenAI was sort of, working with Microsoft, but it was not a large firm coming up with a huge innovation. People actually worry nowadays that large firms are hindering innovation because they take up for such large market shares and they don't have much competition, and therefore they don't come up with as much innovation. And therefore I think, and we know that a lot of economic dynamism comes from small firms, and we know that financing is very important for small firms to grow up to their potential, and that's why I care a lot about how they are being financed.
I see an analogy here because we're artists, and artists don't typically make a lot of money until they get very successful. Right. And then those successful artists book all the gigs, right? Like in comedy. So, wouldn't it be cool if there was like VCs for like starving artists?
Yeah, I think so. You need to be able to, bring up something new that people haven't seen, but you need to find your audience. And this is really what VCs do. Like VCs do an amazing job. Actually, they are very smart people. They have a bag of tools that they bring every time they invest in a startup. They enable the startup to find new employees. They let them access to their network of, potential suppliers, but also employees. They give them funding. So we know that startups do better thanks to VCs. And so if you're really good, but you're kind of small, you want to find this one agent or this one VC that is going to take your potential and take your relative advantage, competitive advantage, and make it blow up and make you become the next star.
You have given a lot of props to VCs, but you also have said in your research that they invest in some firms that perform predictably poorly. Why do they do that? Are they just looking to invest in poor performing companies as like a charity? Why are they doing these things?
No, not at all. I think that VCs do an amazing job, and we know that a lot of today's biggest, most successful firms have been VC financed in the past. What we're trying to say in the paper is that VCs, at the end of the day, are humans. And humans just cannot deal with like very complex ways through which characteristics would map into success. And what we find really is that VCs as humans are following cues, are investing into entrepreneurs that look like success, which is exactly what they should do. So at the first order, they're doing a good thing, and there's a kernel of truth to what they're doing, but perhaps they do too much of it, again, which is a very human trait.
To think that because they've had success with one kind of entrepreneur, that will lead them to success in the future?
Yeah, but even beyond their own experience, they can look at the economy, and I can ask you like, who is the entrepreneur that comes to mind if I'm asking you about a successful entrepreneur?
Well, I've thought about this a lot, but if I didn't think about this a lot, I would say the same things everyone says, like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and,
Right. So a young male who dropped out of a big Ivy League or something like that.
Exactly.
This is what most people think about, and this is what memory models would tell you. They are like entrepreneurs who come to mind more easily because they are more accessible in your brain and because their characteristics are highly representative of success. It doesn't mean that any dropout from Yale or Harvard will become the next Mark Zuckerberg.
So what's the problem with investing only in young white males? I mean, there's a lot of problems, but I want you as a young white male to say that.
Well, so there are problems with it, obviously. If you do too much of that, it means that you're well intentioned. And I don't think that VCs are investing into those entrepreneurs purposefully. But I think they have high powered incentives to invest into entrepreneurs who are going to be successful. And when they think of success, they think of the pool of entrepreneurs who are successful, who tend to be young males in my French data from Paris, which is the hub, um, and, uh, and that's just a behavioral trait that is proper to humans.
You've looked at French data mostly, so it might not be the same as in the United States, but you've mentioned white, you've mentioned Parisian male. Is wearing a hoodie also a positive signal for venture investment?
So I just want to say I did not mention white because France does not have data on race. It does not collect data on race for like historical reasons. So I focus on like age and gender and the industry and the location, that kind of thing. But obviously, we know that the way you present yourself and the way you pitch your idea matters a lot. Actually, people have looked at how VCs look at male versus female in like a video environment, also or things like that, and there seems to be again a bias against traits that seem to be proper to females.
It seems like there's so many people with ideas, and it's hard for them to find the VCs.
It's extremely hard. And
Yeah.
again, I think that they do a good job. It's just that we show that they have behavioral traits that lead them to make some decisions that are not good.
I think of it like fish in the ocean. There's a lot of fish in the ocean, but those fish need to find the VC that helps them out. I propose a show where people with ideas go on it and they pitch it to the VC. We call it Fish Tank.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I've become a fan of such shows, and I learned a lot from it. And you have examples of VCs turning down some entrepreneurs who later on do very well, even on such shows. But yeah, I mean, that's a great idea. I would love to have a show where we can also randomize the kind of people who show up, and you can randomize, I don't know, skin tone or gender for like keeping everything else controlled the exact same. As a researcher, I would love that, but obviously we have to work with a lot of limitations of data, and not everybody is the exact same in every single way. But this is why we use machine learning to try and control for everything at the same time in a way that is very flexible.
So tell me how you did it. Did you run an experiment? What did you do?
So this is, we were not able to run an experiment where we would take two exactly identical people or two exactly identical startups. Say you two had like each, had a startup that is the exact same. I would love to send each of you to the same VC and see how they would judge you differently based on the exact same idea. But this is not possible to do in reality, unfortunately. So what we do is we teach an algorithm to predict success based on entrepreneur characteristics. And the algorithm is able to take into account everything that we know about you and that is recorded in the data, your education, your gender, your experience, how many firms you've created in the past, and so on and so forth. And then it will create a predicted measure of success. And the algorithm is a lot more complex than the human brain, so it's able to take into account interaction between variables and also nonlinearities and anything that is very hard for a human to do. And then there are techniques to see whether a given characteristic that is predictive of success is being exaggerated by VCs in their decisions. We're trying to see whether a given characteristic seems to matter over and beyond how much it matters for the predicted performance.
And what did you find in terms of investment decisions?
Well, we found two things: that the algorithm selects more female entrepreneurs, they select more middle-aged entrepreneurs, and more entrepreneurs who are based outside of Paris, which is the hub in France. also less entrepreneurs in the high-tech sector. The algorithm basically selects firms that are sort of like outside of the usual stereotype of successful entrepreneurs. And we find that this explains two sources of mistakes in VC's decisions. So there are two sources of mistakes that are being made. When you compare the profile of entrepreneurs that are selected by the algorithm to those that are selected by VCs, you find that VCs tend to invest into some entrepreneurs who are predictably bad, and they tend to overlook other entrepreneurs who are predictably good.
And what about high tech? I just thought that investors were investing in high tech because that was high growth, like Sammy. Is that a mistake to only look at high tech as a high growth area for venture capitalists? What would the model predict?
So that is a good question. Some VCs are focused on a given industry. And obviously, you need to have a lot of knowledge of that given industry if you want to be able to help out entrepreneurs in that given industry. What the model is telling us is that there seems to be too much venture capital allocation in that industry compared to others. So we're not really saying that VCs should invest all of their money outside of high tech. We're saying that perhaps there is a little too much money in high tech compared to other sectors, because we do find entrepreneurs in other sectors who are very promising and who would have, yielded a lot of money for VCs.
What excites you the most about the future of VCs and entrepreneurship?
Well, I am interested in VCs and entrepreneurs because I want to know where the next innovations will come from, and I want to make sure that the economy is at its best by having the right incentives for people to start firms. And so what excites me the most is to try and think of where the next breakthrough will come from and how this is going to be deployed at a scale that will allow for growth, job creation, and value creation.
Amazing. When you think about your research, what's next? Will you expand the data set to other countries, or will you look across the European Union, or maybe try to get access to US-based data? Where do you want to take your research?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much all of the above. So yes, I started by...
You're a high growth researcher.
Well, I'm trying to be. Let's see if you will invest into my research, and referees will. Basically, so I'm in the process of gathering data for the US, because obviously most of the world innovation is coming from the US nowadays. But I'm also trying to keep an eye open on where the main sources of growth come from. And in a lot of regards, young, high growth startups might actually come from outside of where venture capital is already being deployed. So I kind of want to look at both VCs' beliefs about entrepreneurs and the ideas that they bring, but I'm also curious about what motivates entrepreneurs and whether the right people sort of select themselves into entrepreneurship. Because you could think that people who start firms are risk takers, and that it takes a little bit of craziness to do so. In fact, in terms of like expected income, it's a better choice to become an employee than an entrepreneur.
Really? Why is that?
Well, because a lot of entrepreneurs go bust. Half of the firms that are being created in a given year will go bust by year 5. So it's a very risky endeavor. And in the US, you also have issues related to like healthcare and these kind of things. You don't have much like insurance that would provide a safety net in case your firm goes bust.
Can you clarify something? I'm American. What is healthcare?
Well, healthcare is this overly priced service that you get in hospitals, and that keeps you alive.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. We only have time for a couple questions before wrap up. Sammy?
What advice would you give to young entrepreneurs?
That's a great question. In a way, the machine learning algorithm that we build is telling you which entrepreneur characteristics map into success. But I want to take that with a huge grain of salt, because the process whereby given characteristics map into success might change over the years. we still know very little about what makes a successful entrepreneur. So I can kind of tell you in my data back in 2010, which is like my test sample, what mattered to be a successful entrepreneur. It's very hard to say right now. There seems to be some amount of predictability, meaning that there are some things that you can do or some knowledge that you can have that would increase your odds of being successful. But A, it's very hard to know whether that is going to continue over time, and B, some of the characteristics that we talk about cannot be are not choice variables that you can change if you'd like.
I have a question. Are investors investing in these entrepreneurs because they have an idea of what makes a successful firm or company, or do you think they have pressure from their LPs on what they think the fund should be doing?
Well, that is a great question. There are some papers that look at like decision making within venture capital firms, and in most cases, a partner is in charge of like every deal, but then there's like some voting going on, and some people have looked at like what's the optimal way to have this voting mechanism and like to make decisions. I haven't seen work that would show that LPs are putting a lot of pressure, but this is actually an interesting idea that would be worth looking at. I know that a lot of institutional investors are investing into this market now, and perhaps they have their own preferences, and perhaps they will tilt VC's incentives to invest into certain types of firms.
It seems like it would be easier to measure and collect data on entrepreneurs because they're out there looking for money. But investors who have the money, I suspect they don't want to talk to people like you.
They actually talk to people more senior than me quite a lot. And so once I become a high growth entrepreneur myself, perhaps I can have the right contacts. But there are some studies that actually survey venture capitalists and that look at that ask them what it is that they do. And it turns out that they view their main task as being selecting startups, which is exactly what my paper is about.
As we wrap up, is there anything that you want to share with the audience or anyone that might watch this to share with them both about your research as well as what you want to tell people about entrepreneurs and investing?
Well, again, I just want to say that entrepreneurship is very important, that we need people to take risks and to bring new ideas. This is how economies grow. We know that startups create a lot of jobs. VCs do an amazing job at helping the startups that they pick, yet VCs are human, and therefore they are subject to some behavioral biases that perhaps leads them to invest a little too much into those characteristics that seem to matter for entrepreneurs to become successful.
And AI can help in that process?
So this is a very thorny issue. There are many ways through which AI can be a very good tool and help VCs, but there are also many ways in which ill-designed algorithms can make things worse. So it really boils down to how you design the algorithm, what it is that you're trying to predict. If you were to try to predict who is going to receive venture capital, you would probably exacerbate biases. You would be picking even more males who are in the high-tech sector, highly educated, because you know that those are the characteristics that VCs care about. And there are many instances in which we've seen that AI seems to exacerbate biases. So carefully designing the algorithm and auditing the algorithm is very important if you were to augment VC's decisions using AI.
Thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much in telling us about your research and spending your time with us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.